The depot platform lay silent under a dying Texas sky. Amber light bled across the horizon, slow and reluctant, the way light moves when it has nowhere left to go. The last coal smoke from the afternoon train had long since dissolved into the cooling air, leaving nothing behind but the smell of iron and distance and promises already broken. Maren Holt sat on the wooden bench at the far end of the platform and did not move. She sat the way a woman sits when she has decided that stillness is the only dignity left available to her. Back straight, chin level, hands folded over the worn leather handles of her mother's carpet bag, pressed against her side as though it were the last solid thing tethering her to the earth. Her dress was faded brown calico, washed so many times the fabric had gone soft as old paper. There was a small tear at the left cuff, mended twice, the thread slightly darker than the cloth around it. She had fixed it herself on the train with a needle she kept in the lining of the bag. She had fixed a great many things herself over the years. 20 minutes earlier, the train carrying the other mail-order brides had departed. Their intended husbands had come, ranchers in worn hats and clean shirts, men who had stood on this same platform with their hands at their sides and their names written on small pieces of paper, waiting. One by one, the other women had stepped down from the cars and been received, some with warmth, some with awkward formality, one with a handshake so brief it bordered on insult. But they had all been received. They had all left the platform with someone. Maren had watched every one of them go. Now the lamps of Sunset Creek flickered to life across the darkening town, orange and gold in the blue dusk. And she sat alone in the space between the life she had fled and the one that had never existed. In her lap was the letter. She had read it so many times the paper had softened at the folds. Percival Good had written with a careful hand, the letters looping and deliberate, the kind of penmanship that takes effort to produce and is meant to impress. He had described his ranch in generous strokes, wide pastures, good water, a solid house with glass windows and a kitchen with a proper iron stove. He had written about the Texas sky at night, how the stars came out so thick and close, a person felt they could reach up and cup them in both hands. He had written that he was a patient man, a God-fearing man, a man who believed a good woman was worth waiting for. He had not come. The station master appeared at the far end of the platform, brass keys jangling against his hip, moving with the shuffling purpose of a man ready to end his day. He was somewhere past 60, with a white mustache and the kind of expression worn by someone who has seen too much and been surprised by very little of it. He stopped when he reached her, looked down at the carpet bag, looked at the letter in her lap. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes did. "Miss," he said quietly, "I'm afraid we're closing up for the evening." Maren touched the thin coin purse in her lap. 12 cents. The sum total of what remained after 3 days of train fare from Columbus, Ohio, 2 nights in a depot waiting room, and 1 meal of cold bread she had bought from a woman on the platform in Abilene. 12 cents was not enough for a room. It was not enough for a meal. It was barely enough to be called money at all. "I'm waiting for someone," she said. The words came out steadier than she felt. That had always been one of her particular skills, keeping her voice level when the rest of her was anything but. The station master recognized the lie for what it was. She could see it in the small tightening around his eyes. But he was a decent man, and he did not say so. He stood quietly for a moment. "There's Mrs. Garfield's boarding house," he offered, 2 streets over. "She sometimes takes women in on account." Maren shook her head once. The station master nodded slowly, like a man accepting a weather report he had not hoped for. He moved away without another word. She opened the letter again, not because she expected to find something new in it. She had memorized every line by now, every careful loop of Percival Good's deliberate penmanship. She read it the way a person presses a bruise, testing the edges of the pain, making sure she understood its full shape. He had painted a picture so convincing she had almost believed it herself. Almost. But on the train from Ohio, somewhere west of Abilene, she had taken out his photograph again. She had studied it in the gray afternoon light coming through the window. Percival Good stood with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being looked at. His coat was good quality wool, fitted at the shoulders. His hat was clean. His boots showed no dirt at all. And behind him, just visible at the edges of the photograph, was the backdrop. A painted studio column, the kind used by city photographers in their indoor portraits. The scroll detail at the base was slightly blurred, the way painted canvas blurs when the camera catches it at the wrong angle. No working cowboy in Sunset Creek, Texas sat for portraits in front of painted studio columns. Maren had folded the photograph back into the envelope. She had held it in her lap for a long moment, watching the brown Texas landscape slide past the window, feeling the particular sensation of a decision that cannot be undone settling into the bones of her chest. She had known then, not everything, but enough. And she had come anyway, because the alternative was going back to Columbus, back to the boarding house where she owed 2 weeks of unpaid rent, back to the textile mill that had terminated her without a letter of reference, on the word of a man whose name she could still hear spoken in that particular tone her supervisor used when he wanted something and did not intend to be refused. Back to her brother's house, where she had stood in the front parlor and watched her own family weigh the word of a man they barely knew against the word of a daughter they had known for 28 years, and choose the man. There was no back. There was only forward, even when forward led to a wooden bench in a Texas depot at dusk with 12 cents in her purse. She folded the letter and placed it in the carpet bag. The sound of spurs crossed the platform behind her. She had not heard the door to the freight office open. He moved quietly for a man his size. She registered the sound before she registered him, the soft, precise percussion of rowels against worn planking, unhurried, without the self-conscious swagger some men put into that sound on purpose. These footsteps belonged to someone who was simply going somewhere and saw no reason to announce it. Maren did not turn around. She heard him finish his business at the freight window. A low exchange with the porter. The scratch of a pen on paper. Then silence, followed by footsteps crossing back toward the depot entrance. The station master's voice, lower this time, carrying the careful murmur of a man sharing information he considered relevant. She could not make out the words. A pause. Then the footsteps changed direction. They came toward her. She kept her eyes on the middle distance, on the lamplight beginning to yellow across the far end of Sunset Creek's main street, on the silhouette of a water tower against the last blue of the sky. She heard him stop. Not close. Far enough away to be respectful. She turned her head. He was tall, the kind of tall that comes with proportion rather than excess. Dust covered his leather chaps and the shoulders of his worn work shirt, the honest dust of a man who had been outside all day doing something that needed doing. His hat was pushed back slightly, not for effect, but the way a man pushes his hat back when he has been thinking hard about something and needs a little more air. His eyes were gray. He looked at her the way she had seen few men look at a woman in difficult circumstances. not with the greedy assessment she had learned to recognize and step back from, not with the particular species of pity that made a person feel smaller for receiving it. He looked at her the way someone looks at a situation they are trying to understand accurately, as if the truth of it mattered and they intended to get it right. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." Maren managed a nod. Something about him registered as different, though she could not have named the specific quality in that first moment, only that she did not feel the instinct to pull her carpet bag closer, which was the instinct she had learned to trust. He moved to leave. The station master reappeared in the doorway. "Miss, I do need to lock up now. Morning train comes through at 7. "He is not coming." Maren said it before she could decide not to. The words came out flat and clear, stripped of the performance of waiting she had been maintaining for the last half hour. Saying them aloud made them real in a way that the letter and the photograph and the empty platform had not quite managed. She had been abandoned. She was alone in a town she had never seen before, with no money and no plan, and no person in the world expecting her anywhere. The cowboy had stopped mid-step. He turned back slowly, without urgency, as if he were giving her time to take back what she had said if she wanted to. She did not take it back. He studied her for a moment, then he came back toward the bench, not all the way. He stopped at a distance that gave her room to refuse him if she chose to, and he kept his hands where she could see them, one hooked in his belt, one at his side, open, unhurried. "Pardon the intrusion," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice worn smooth by years of not being raised. "I couldn't help overhearing." He touched the brim of his hat again, a gesture she was beginning to understand was habit rather than performance. "Calder Merritt. I run a ranch about 4 miles north of here. The Merritt place." Maren's shoulders remained level, though something inside her tightened. She had been in enough difficult situations to know what came next. The generous offer, the helpful hand that cost more than it gave. She had learned this lesson carefully, and she did not intend to forget it. "My cook left 3 weeks ago," Calder Merritt continued. His tone did not change. No shift toward charm, no softening meant to lower her guard. He spoke as if he were reporting a fact about the weather. "Left without notice, which is its own story. My men have been living on salt pork and burnt coffee since August. It's beginning to affect their temperament." He paused. "The job is yours, if you want it. Room, board, and wages. Separate quarters with a bolt on the door. Your only obligation is keeping 20 cowboys fed. No other claims on your time." Maren looked at him. "Why?" she asked. It was the only question that mattered. She had learned not to accept the surface of things without understanding what lay beneath them. A man she had never met, offering help she had not asked for on a darkening platform in a town she had arrived in 3 hours ago. The question was not suspicious. It was simply necessary. His eyes dropped to the letter visible at the top of her carpet bag, where she had not quite pushed it down all the way. Then they came back to her face. "Because I know what it looks like when plans come apart," he said, quietly, without drama. "And because a woman who sits straight like that, when everything else has gone sideways, is the sort of woman who can handle ranch life without falling to pieces at the first hard morning." The station master made a small sound behind him. Not quite agreement, not quite endorsement, but something in that neighborhood. Maren looked down at the carpet bag in her lap. Her mother had carried this bag for 20 years before her. It had been to 3 states and back. It had held everything the Holt women owned at one point or another, including the envelope of seeds her mother had carried all the way from Pennsylvania in the belief that zinnias would grow anywhere a person was determined enough to water them. 12 cents. Her mother's voice, quiet and practical, somewhere in the region of her left shoulder. Sometimes the only real choice is which risk to take. Maren stood. She rose with the deliberate steadiness of someone who has decided something and intends to commit to it fully. Her spine was straight. Her chin was level. She looked at Calder Merritt with the clear, direct gaze of a woman who has been underestimated before, and learned to meet that as a kind of gift. "Mr. Merritt," she said, "I accept." He nodded once. No smile, no relief, no performance of generosity. Just acknowledgement, as if her answer was reasonable and the matter was now settled. "We should leave before full dark," he said. "Road's easier in the last of the light." He led her to a Studebaker wagon waiting beside the depot, 2 gray draft horses standing patient in their traces. The kind of horses that had worked long enough together that they no longer needed to be told what the other was doing. The wagon was solid and practical, the bed loaded with supplies from the freight office, sacks of flour and coils of rope, and a crate of something that smelled of machine oil. He reached for her carpet bag. Maren's hand tightened on the handle before she could stop it. Everything she owned was in that bag. Everything she had left. The instinct to hold it was not something she could fully reason away in the space of 60 seconds. He waited, not impatiently. He simply stood with his hand extended and let her work through whatever she needed to work through. She released the bag. He took it with both hands and placed it in the wagon bed with the kind of care a person gives to something that belongs to someone else and deserves to arrive undamaged. Not tossed, not set down carelessly, placed. She noticed that. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. "Steps a bit high," he said, and offered his hand. She looked at his palm. The calluses were heavy across the base of his fingers, the kind built by years of rope work and fence building and the particular labor of a ranch in a dry country. His hand was warm against the cooling evening air, clean despite the dust on his clothes. Percival Good had written her poetry. This man offered her a hand up into a wagon. It felt more honest than anything she had received in a long time. Maren placed her fingers in his and climbed up. His grip was brief and functional. No lingering. No pressure beyond what the task required. She settled onto the seat and folded her hands in her lap, and he came around to the other side and took up the reins without comment. "Mr. Merritt," she said as the horses moved forward, "I want to be direct about something." "Go ahead." "I am accepting a position of employment, nothing more than that. I expect separate quarters, as you said. I expect to be treated with the same respect you would give any hired hand on your property. If those conditions are not honored, I will leave. I don't have many resources, but I have enough stubbornness to walk back to town if I need to." A pause. The wagon rolled past the lit windows of the saloon. Faces turned briefly in the lamplight, curious, already calculating. "You'll have both," Calder Merritt said. "The kitchen house has its own room and a bolt I had put on last spring. My men behave according to certain standards or they don't stay on my property. That's been true since I bought the place 15 years ago, and it will be true tomorrow." He said it without emphasis. It was not a reassurance designed to persuade her. It was simply a statement of the way things were, offered because she had asked and deserved an accurate answer. The wagon left the edge of town. The road stretched ahead into the dark, two pale lines through the short grass, curving north toward a horizon thick with stars. The Texas sky opened above them, vast and cold and indifferent in the most magnificent way, the kind of sky that made a person feel simultaneously very small and very free. Maren breathed it in. She had not taken a full breath in 3 days. The lantern hanging from the wagon's side bracket cast a small circle of warmth around them, gold against the blue dark, close and private as a room. The horses moved with a steady, rhythmic pull. Somewhere out in the grass, something called and went quiet again. "May I ask something?" Maren said after a long while. "You may. You said you know what it looks like when plans come apart." She kept her voice neutral, the inquiry genuine rather than pointed. Was that a general observation or a specific one? The silence lasted long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Specific," he said finally. She did not press him. She had learned the difference between a person who did not want to speak and a person who was not yet ready to, and she had learned that the second kind would tell you what they needed to tell you when the time was right, if you left them room to get there. The wagon rolled on through the dark. She was looking at the road ahead, at the pale dust rising and settling in the lantern light, when she noticed it. On the left side of the reins, looped around the leather and knotted with a care that suggested it had been placed deliberately rather than left by accident, was a small piece of cloth. A ribbon, or what had once been a ribbon, before sun and weather and years had softened it past its original purpose. It was blue, or had been. Now it was closer to gray, the color of old cornflowers pressed between the pages of a book. It was small. It was faded. It was not the kind of thing a man living alone on a working ranch would have on his reins by accident. Maren looked at it for a moment, then she looked away, back to the stars spreading across the black sky ahead of them, back to the wide country opening up around the road as the town fell behind. She did not ask. But the question was there now, quiet and patient, like a lamp left burning in a window. Someone had tied that ribbon there. Someone who was no longer here to untie it. And the man beside her, who had not taken it down in however many years it had been, kept driving north through the dark without explaining a thing. The lights of Sunset Creek faded behind them. Ahead, somewhere past the next rise, where the land flattened out and the grass ran silver in the starlight, a ranch waited. A kitchen full of someone else's disorder. 20 hungry cowboys and a foreman who would not be glad to see her, work she knew how to do, and a situation she had not yet fully measured. Maren Holt straightened her spine against the wagon seat. She had 12 cents and a carpet bag and 3 days of train grime on her only dress and no idea what the next morning would bring. She had survived worse beginnings than this. The horse on the left snorted softly. The stars burned cold and close overhead. The wagon rolled on through the September dark, and Maren did not look back at the town, not once, because looking back had never once helped her, and she did not intend to start now. Behind her, the lights of Sunset Creek went out one by one. Ahead, everything else remained to be seen. The kitchen was worse than she had expected. Maren stood in the doorway with the lantern Calder had handed her at the threshold of the kitchen house, holding it up so the light reached the far corners, and took a careful accounting of what she was dealing with. Flour dusted every flat surface, dried to a fine gray crust in the places where it had been wet and then forgotten. 3 cast-iron skillets sat on the stove with the remains of something in them that had gone past burnt and into a category of its own. A crock of lard had been left open on the shelf long enough to collect a quarter-inch of dust on its surface. The wood pile beside the stove was low. The water barrel was less than a quarter full. The floor had not been swept in what she estimated was several weeks. She set the lantern on the table. She looked at the room for exactly as long as it took to understand it fully, and then she stopped looking and started working. That was the thing about hard beginnings. They were not improved by studying them. She found the broom behind the door and started with the floor. By the time the clock in the main house struck 5, the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and frying bacon and something else, something warm and yeasty and alive. Maren had discovered the sourdough starter tucked behind a row of dusty preserve jars on the back shelf, a small crock sealed with a cloth tied down with twine. She had almost set it aside. Then she lifted the cloth and found it still breathing, barely, a thin layer of gray liquid on top that meant neglect, but not death. She fed it a handful of flour and a measure of warm water and set it near the stove where the warmth would reach it, and then she went on with the rest of what needed doing. The men began arriving shortly after 5, filtering in from the bunkhouse in ones and twos, hats pulled low, moving with the careful economy of people who had not yet had coffee. Maren heard them before she saw them, boots on the steps, a low murmur, then a pause at the door. She turned from the stove. 20 men, or near enough, various heights and ages and degrees of mourning expression, from the young ones who had the open-faced uncertainty of boys who had grown up faster than they were ready for, to the older hands who had learned to show nothing until they had decided what they were looking at. They stopped in the doorway and looked at the table. Bacon, crisp, and laid out in even rows on a folded cloth. Eggs turned just past the point where the yolk was still soft. Biscuits, tall and gold-topped, stacked on a board in the center of the table. A pot of gravy, dark and proper. Coffee so strong the smell of it alone was a kind of argument for getting up in the morning. The youngest one, somewhere around 16, with a gap between his front teeth and the beginnings of a beard that had not yet committed to its purpose, took a biscuit before he had properly sat down. He bit into it, stopped. "This," he said, with the absolute sincerity of someone making a theological statement, "is real food." Silence fell as the others tasted it, the kind of silence that happens when something exceeds expectation by enough to require a moment of adjustment. Then chairs scraped, hats came off. The room filled with the sound of men eating with genuine feeling. Gideon Rawls came in last. She had been told about the foreman by the way the other men moved around the space he had not yet occupied, the slight straightening of posture, the particular quieting of the younger ones. He was somewhere past 50, with a gray beard trimmed close, and the kind of eyes that had done a great deal of measuring over the years and found most things wanting. He stopped just inside the door and looked at the table, and then looked at her with an expression that communicated, with efficient clarity, that he had seen cooks come and go at Merritt Ranch for longer than she had likely been alive, and was prepared to be entirely unimpressed. He pulled out his chair. He sat. He picked up a biscuit. He bit into it. A pause of perhaps 3 seconds, during which nothing on his face changed at all. He set the biscuit down, picked up his coffee, drank, set that down too. "How'd you get these biscuits this high?" he said. Not warmly, but without the edge she had been prepared for. "Lard instead of butter," Maren said, "and a light hand. You can't work biscuit dough the way you work bread dough. They don't respond to pressure." Gideon looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the biscuit again and finished it. When Calder Merritt came through the kitchen door near the end of breakfast, the room did the thing rooms do when a man of authority walks in. A slight collective adjustment, an awareness. He moved to the table without ceremony and poured his own coffee and took the chair at the far end, and every man there watched him lift his biscuit and take a bite, watched his expression, waited. He chewed. He swallowed. He set down the biscuit and looked across the table at Maren, who was standing at the stove with a cloth in her hands, watching him with the same calm directness she applied to most things. "Miss Holt," he said, "I believe you may have saved this ranch." "It's just breakfast," she said. But the young man with the gap between his teeth looked up from his plate and shook his head in a way that made several of the others laugh, and Maren turned back to the stove before anyone could see that she was very nearly smiling. She did not stop moving for the rest of the morning. The kitchen became hers inside of 3 days, not by declaration, but by the natural order of competence. She learned the stove's temperament, which damper needed coaxing in the morning and which ran too hot by midday. She organized the larder according to a logic she had developed over years of keeping house on insufficient budgets, where the things used most lived at the front and the things used rarely waited at the back, and nothing was wasted that could be preserved, dried, or rendered down into something useful. She restarted the sourdough, feeding it daily until it was strong enough to bake with, and by the 4th morning she had bread rising on the back counter, 2 loaves, dense and fragrant, the kind that lasted 3 days if you kept it wrapped in cloth. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, she found the saddlebag. She was clearing out the lower cabinet beside the stove, a dark space that had been used as a general repository for objects without other homes, broken tack buckles, a tin of bear grease with no lid, 3 candle stubs, and behind all of it, pushed to the very back, a saddlebag of worn brown leather with the initials CB stamped on the flap. She pulled it out, set it on the table. It was not locked. The buckle had simply been fastened and left. She did not open it. Whatever was in it was not her business, and she was clear on the distinction between what was hers to know and what was not. But when she carried it to the main house and set it on the table beside the front door, she noticed the ledger. It was sitting on the shelf by the window, unremarkable, the kind of book used for keeping accounts. Ranch expenses, likely. Feed, labor, materials, the ongoing arithmetic of running a large operation. She would not have looked twice at it, except that the corner of a loose page was visible at the top, where someone had opened the book recently and not quite returned the page to its proper place. She paused. The loose page had a column of numbers on it. She could see the edge of them from where she stood. She had spent 4 years keeping the accounts at the Hartwell Mill in Columbus before the situation with the superintendent that had ended her employment there, and she had a particular kind of relationship with numbers that meant they tended to catch her eye the way a wrong note catches the ear of a person who has studied music. Something about the partial column she could see felt uneven. She looked at it for a moment, then she left the saddlebag on the table and went back to the kitchen. It was not her ledger. It was not her business. And she had work to do, but the numbers stayed with her through the afternoon, quiet and insistent, the way things do when the mind has noticed something real and is not yet ready to let it rest. On the 2nd week, Percival Good arrived in Sunset Creek. She heard about it from the youngest cowhand, the gap-toothed boy called Fletcher, who had ridden into town for a supply run and come back with a crate of dried goods and more information than he had been sent to collect. A well-dressed man from back east, Fletcher reported to no one in particular over the supper table, had taken a room at the Sunset Creek Hotel and was asking around town about a woman by the name of Maren Holt. Said he had business with her, said there had been a misunderstanding. Fletcher said this without looking at Maren directly, in the way of someone who understood they were delivering information that had sharp edges and was trying to put it down carefully. The table went quiet. Maren kept her hands moving. She was cutting cornbread into squares, and she kept cutting, straight and even, not looking up until she had finished the row. Then she set down the knife and looked at Fletcher with a pleasant and entirely neutral expression. "Thank you for letting me know," she said. She served the rest of supper. She washed the dishes. She banked the stove for the night. And then she went to her room in the kitchen house, bolted the door, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time with her hands in her lap. A misunderstanding. That was the word he had used. She turned it over the way you turn a stone to see what lies underneath it. Percival Good, who had written her 2 letters full of careful penmanship and generous description and not one true thing, had come to Sunset Creek and was calling his failure to appear at the depot a misunderstanding. He had not come. He had not written to explain. He had waited a week and a half and then ridden into town and used the word misunderstanding, as if language were a kind of eraser. He could run over the shape of what he had done until it became something more convenient. She thought about the photograph, the painted studio column, the dress boots. Then she thought about Mrs. Cornelia Fitch. She had encountered Mrs. Fitch on her first trip into town for supplies. A tall woman, dressed with the careful precision of someone for whom appearance is a form of argument, moving through the general store with the authority of a person who has been the most significant woman in a small community for long enough that it has become a settled fact of local geography. She had looked at Maren with the particular expression of someone cataloging information they intend to use. "You're the young woman staying at Merritt Ranch," she had said, not quite asking. "I'm employed there," Maren had said, "as a cook." Mrs. Fitch had made a small sound, not agreement and not disagreement, somewhere in the range of interest carefully arranged to resemble neutrality. Now there was Percival Good in the hotel, with his word misunderstanding and his clean boots, and Mrs. Cornelia Fitch, with her careful eyes, and her position at the center of Sunset Creek's social architecture. Maren understood the shape of what was coming. She had grown up in a small enough town to know how these things moved. She sat in the dark and let herself feel the weight of it for the time it deserved. Then she lay down and went to sleep. She had work in the morning. It was on the 11th night that the kitchen house door did not latch properly in the wind, and Maren, a light sleeper from years of necessity, woke to the sound of it tapping against the frame. She lay in the dark for a moment, listening. The wind had picked up from the south, warm and unsettled, carrying the smell of distant rain that would not arrive for days yet, the kind of wind that made horses restless. She rose, pulled on her boots and her coat over her nightgown, stepped out into the yard. The main barn doors were open, not blown open by the wind. The latch was the heavy iron kind that did not move in ordinary weather. Someone had unfastened it. The doors stood wide, letting the lamplight from inside spill out in a long yellow rectangle across the dark yard. Maren crossed the yard. She pushed the barn door open further and stepped in. She heard them before she saw them clearly. A low, labored breathing from the first stall, the irregular rhythm of something in pain. In the second stall, a horse stood pressed against the far wall, head low, ribs showing under a coat that had gone dull and dry. And in the third stall, in the pool of light from a lantern hanging on the post, a black gelding turned slowly at her entrance, and she could see the dark lines of cuts across his flank, deep ones, the kind left by wire. Maren went still for a moment. She had grown up with horses. Her father had kept 3 plow horses on the Holt farm until the bank had taken 2 of them in the dry summer of 1868, and she had learned the vocabulary of their pain before she had learned to read. She knew the difference between a horse that was frightened and a horse that was suffering, and she knew that the animals in front of her were beyond frightened. She went to the tack room, found carbolic acid and clean rags on the shelf, the basic medicines of any working ranch. Not enough, but a start. She went out the back of the barn to the kitchen garden she had begun putting in order the previous week and pulled comfrey and what passage for calendula in the dry September soil. Herbs her mother had used on everything from cuts to infection with a conviction that had rarely been wrong. She was working on the gelding's flank, speaking to him in the low, steady murmur that horses respond to, not because they understand the words, but because they understand the intention behind them, when the sound of boots on hard dirt crossed the yard. The barn doors opened fully. A man filled the frame, tall and wide-shouldered, a rifle held low in one hand, not raised, not pointed, but present. He had clearly come quickly, shirt half-buttoned, boots without spurs, the deliberate alertness of someone expecting trouble. He stopped. Calder Merritt looked from the gelding to the herbs spread on the stall floor, to Maren's hands and then to her face, and whatever he had been prepared to find, it had not been this. "I saw the doors," Maren said. Her hands kept moving, gentle and steady. "These animals needed help." He crossed to the stall. He looked at the gelding's flank. At the cuts, she had already cleaned and begun to treat. At the poultice, she had prepared from the comfrey. He set the rifle against the post. He crouched beside her and looked at the wound with the careful attention of a man who knew what he was looking at. "How bad?" he said. "The cuts will heal if they don't infect. He needs to be kept clean," and the poultice changed morning and evening. She sat back and looked toward the second stall, where the gaunt mare stood with her head still low. "That one worries me more. She's too thin. It's been going on longer than tonight." Calder looked at the mare for a long moment. Something moved across his face that was not quite an expression, more the shadow of one. "She came in off the range last spring, tangled in wire. We got her free, but she stopped eating." "Grief," Maren said. He looked at her. "Horses grieve," she said. "They do it quietly, so people miss it. But they feel the loss of things." She turned back to the gelding, running her hand along the jaw, feeling the animal settle under the contact. "What are their names?" A pause. "The gelding is Sable. The mare is Rosie." He moved toward the first stall, where the bay with the swollen leg stood careful and still. "And this is Duchess." Maren looked at Duchess. The swelling in the left foreleg was considerable, hot to the touch when she pressed carefully around the joint. Not broken, but badly strained, and left untreated long enough that the tissue had begun to react. "How long has she been favoring that leg?" "Few weeks." The word came out with a quality she recognized as guilt, the particular flatness of a person acknowledging a failure they have not forgiven themselves for yet. "I kept meaning to." She did not respond to that. There was no useful thing to say about time already past. "Honey and comfrey on the leg," she said instead. "Wrapped, not tight, just enough to hold the poultice. Cold water from the creek on the outside of the wrapping twice a day to keep the swelling down." He was quiet for a moment. "You know horses." "My father kept them." She moved to Duchess's leg and began working. We couldn't afford a veterinarian, so we learned. He watched her hands. She was aware of him watching. The specific quality of attention he gave things he was trying to understand. It was different from the way most men watched her, which was a kind of looking that had something underneath it. This was simpler than that, more direct. Like a man who wanted to know how something worked because the knowing itself mattered to him. They worked side by side for what she estimated was an hour, maybe more. The rhythm of it settled naturally, without discussion. When she needed water, he brought it before she asked. When he steadied Sable's head so she could reach the deeper of the cuts, he held the horse with a patience and a gentleness that she found herself noting with a precision she had not been applying to him before. Once, reaching across him for a fresh rag, their hands met at the bucket handle. Neither of them moved for a breath's length. Then she took the rag and he let go and they went on working. The barn was quiet around them. The warm smell of hay and horse and the sharp medicinal edge of carbolic. Lantern light moving in the faint breath of air through the open doors. "You come out here at night?" she asked somewhere in the second half of the hour. "Most nights," he said. He was wrapping Duchess's leg with the careful precision of a man who had decided to do something right and was going to take the time it required. These three have been through enough. They deserve better than being written off. Maren looked at the side of his face, at the set of his jaw, and the way his hands moved on the bandage with that particular deliberateness. A man who kept wounded horses alive because they deserved better than being written off. She looked away before he could notice her looking. "Fear doesn't help anything heal," she said to the space in front of her. "Trust does. They need to know someone is coming back." He did not answer immediately. She heard him tie off the bandage and straighten. When she finally looked at him, he was looking at her, and the quality of his gaze had shifted, not in a way she could name exactly, only that it was different from what it had been an hour ago when he had come through the barn doors with a rifle in his hand and the clear intention of dealing with whatever trouble had arrived. "Would you come again tomorrow night?" he said. "They settle better when you're here." Maren looked at Duchess, who had dropped her head and closed her eyes with the tentative trust of an animal beginning to remember that not all hands were something to move away from. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." The next night she came, and the night after that. On the fourth night, reaching past him for the lantern, she noticed the tack room shelf. An object she had not seen the first time because she had not been looking for it and the lantern angle had been different. A pair of women's gloves, very small. The kind made for a hand considerably smaller than her own, folded with the careful exactness of someone who had put them down intending to pick them up again and then had not been able to. Brown leather, soft, worn to a suppleness that meant they had been used for years before they were set down. Beside them, propped against the back wall of the shelf, a photograph turned face down. Maren looked at the gloves for a long moment. She did not touch them. She did not touch the photograph. When Calder came back with the fresh water, she was working on Rosie's ribs with a slow circular motion, the kind that encouraged circulation and let the horse feel contact without pressure. She did not turn around. He did not offer any explanation. The gloves and the photograph behind her on the shelf, and the blue ribbon on his reins, and the curtains in the upstairs window of the main house that no one had taken down, they all belonged to the same answer to a question she had not asked yet. She already understood the shape of it. She had understood it since the first night, if she was honest with herself. She had simply been giving it the room it needed, the way you give a bruise time before you decide how bad it is. It was near midnight when they finished and walked back across the yard in the direction of the kitchen house. The stars were thick and cold overhead. The grass smelled of dew beginning to form. At her door, she stopped and turned. He had been about to say something. She could see him consider it, the slight gathering of breath, the way a person organizes words before they say them. Then he seemed to decide against it, or perhaps to defer it, which was not the same thing. "Good night, Miss Holt," he said. "Good night, Mr. Merritt." She went inside and drew the bolt. She stood in the dark of her room and pressed her back against the door and listened to his footsteps cross the yard to the main house, steady and unhurried, the way he did everything. Then she moved to the small table by the window and sat down and opened the ledger. She had brought it from the shelf that afternoon while Calder and the hands were out on the range, telling herself she was simply going to look at the loose page, satisfy the instinct that had been nagging at her, and put it back. She looked at the loose page. Then she looked at the page before it, and the page before that. She sat at the table for an hour with the ledger open in front of her, working through the columns with the focused attention of someone who has spent years in the company of numbers and knows their habits. The ordinary expenses of a working ranch were visible in the figures, feed and labor and materials and maintenance, the expected arithmetic of a large operation in this country. But threaded through them, beginning about 8 months back, was a pattern. Small amounts, inconsistent in size and timing, which was exactly the kind of variation designed to prevent a pattern from being noticed. $50 in January, $30 in March, $90 in April, which had been split across 3 separate line items under different headings. $120 in July, broken into 4 separate entries logged 2 weeks apart. Maren turned back to January and added the numbers slowly. Then she added them again. She set down the pencil and looked at what she had written. $480 over 8 months, drawn from the Merritt Ranch accounts in increments small enough to disappear into the ordinary noise of running a large operation, but large enough, accumulated, to be doing serious damage. This was not a clerical error. The entries were too deliberately varied, too careful in their timing, for that explanation to hold. Someone was bleeding this ranch dry. Maren closed the ledger. She sat with her hands flat on the cover and looked at the wall in front of her. She did not know yet who. She did not know yet how. She had a clear picture of what and a reasonably accurate picture of the scope, but the rest of it would take more time and more looking, and she was not prepared to say anything until she knew enough to say it accurately. She put the ledger back on the shelf the next morning before anyone was awake. That afternoon, the postwriter brought a letter. She recognized the handwriting before she registered the name on the outside. The same careful loops, the same deliberate penmanship designed to impress. She took the letter to the kitchen house. She did not sit down. She opened it standing at the table. Miss Holt. A misunderstanding has kept me from fulfilling our arrangement. I am currently in Sunset Creek attending to business and am prepared to resolve this matter to your satisfaction. You will present yourself at the hotel at your earliest convenience. A woman in your circumstances has very few alternatives, and I believe you know this. She read it twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the pocket of her apron, and she went back to the stove and stirred the soup that was building toward supper, and she let the heat of the fire warm her face while she decided what she thought about things. A woman in your circumstances has very few alternatives. Outside the kitchen window, the evening was coming in from the east, blue and slow. 3 cowboys crossed the yard toward the bunkhouse, talking about something that made the youngest one laugh. From the barn, she could hear Gideon Rawls going through the routine of closing up for the night. On the shelf in the main house, the ledger sat by the window with its careful record of a loss that had been going on for 8 months. Maren stirred the soup. She thought about what she knew. She thought about what she did not yet know. She thought about the ribbon on the reins, and the gloves on the tack room shelf, and the way Calder Merritt had said these three deserve better than being written off in a voice that had not been talking only about horses. She thought about the 12 cents in her purse the night she had stepped off this particular wagon and walked into this particular kitchen, about the bruised sourdough starter she had found behind the dusty jars, barely alive, not yet dead, needing only attention and warmth, and the daily discipline of being fed. She stirred the soup, and she decided, quietly and without drama, that she was not going anywhere. Not toward Percival Good. Not away from here. She was going to find out who was draining this ranch dry, and she was going to do it with the same patience she had applied to the sourdough and the 3 injured horses and every other broken thing that had crossed her path. She was going to stay, at least until she understood what she was staying for. The soup came to a boil. She turned down the damper, adjusted the heat, and went to ring the bell for supper. The evening star was out over the barn roof, bright and early, burning steady in the pale sky above the darkening land. Somewhere in town, in a hotel room with clean curtains, Percival Good was waiting for her answer. He would wait a long time. The nights had begun to cool, not the deep cold that would come later when the Texas sky turned iron gray and the water in the troughs skinned over before dawn. This was the first cooling, the tentative withdrawing of summer from the land, the way heat releases its hold gradually, as if reluctant to admit that anything changes. The days were still warm, but the evenings carried something different now, a quality of air that made a person pull their coat a little closer and look at the fire a little longer. Maren had moved the rocking chair from the corner of the kitchen house to the small porch outside the door. She sat there in the evenings after supper was done, and the dishes were washed and the stove was banked for the night, and she let the cooling air settle around her while the ranch quieted down. The bunkhouse light going out, the barn going dark, the stars coming up one by one over the flat land to the east. It was on one of these evenings that Calder Merritt came and sat on the porch steps. He did not ask. He simply came across the yard with 2 cups of coffee and set one on the rail beside her and sat down on the top step with his back against the post, long legs stretched out, and looked at the same stars she had been looking at, as if this were an arrangement that had already been agreed upon, which in some way she supposed it had, in the gradual and wordless manner that certain things between people get agreed upon. She picked up the coffee. She did not say anything for a while. Neither did he. This was one of the things she had noticed about Calder Merritt in the 3 weeks she had been here. He did not fill silence the way some men did, as if quiet were a problem requiring immediate remedy. He sat inside it without apparent discomfort, and after long enough in his company, she had begun to find this restful in a way she had not anticipated. "The nights are changing," she said after a while. "Always do this time of year." He turned the cup in his hands. "Another 6 weeks, you'll want a heavier coat." She considered that. The implication of 6 weeks. that it was simply assumed she would still be here in 6 weeks, with a heavier coat, that the question of duration had been settled without discussion at some point she had not noticed. She found she did not want to dispute it. "Rosie ate this evening," she said. "The full ration. First time." He was quiet for a moment. Then quietly, "I know. I saw." She looked at the side of his face. He was looking out toward the barn, toward the dark space where the 3 horses were settled for the night, and she recognized in his expression the specific texture of relief in a person who has been worried for a long time and is only now beginning to allow themselves to stop. It looked like tiredness. It looked like something loosening, slowly, the way cold hands loosen near a fire. "You've been watching them," she said, "every evening. From the main house window, the one that faces the barn." He did not answer right away. "Yes." She turned back to the stars. The coffee was strong and slightly bitter, the way he made it, which she had stopped trying to adjust after the first week because she had discovered she preferred it. "There's something I want to tell you," he said. She waited. He turned the cup in his hands. He looked at the yard, the dark shape of the fence line, the pale dust of the road. She had learned by now the particular quality of stillness that came over him when he was approaching something he did not say easily, and she sat inside it with him without rushing it, the way she sat inside the difficult moments with the horses, letting him find his way to it at the pace it required. "My wife's name was Nora," he said. The night settled around the word. She died in the summer of 1878. Fever. It came through this part of the country in June and moved fast, the way fevers do in dry heat. He paused. "I was in the north pasture. We'd had trouble with the fence line up there. 3 days of repair work. I was sleeping out rather than riding back each night. She was fine when I left. Or she seemed fine." Another pause. Longer. "She was gone before I got back." Maren did not move. She held the coffee cup and looked at the middle distance and listened with the full weight of her attention. "The hands didn't send someone for me until it was already settled," he said. "They thought they were sparing me, riding out to tell a man while there was still time to come back and watch the ending of it." Something shifted in his voice, not breaking, more like a door pushed open to the limit of its hinges. "I think about that, still, what I might have said, if I'd had the chance to say it." The fire inside the kitchen house had burned down to coals. She could feel its warmth through the door she had left open, faint and steady. "What would you have said?" she asked, quietly, not intrusively, the way you ask when the question itself is an act of witness. He was quiet for so long, she thought he had decided not to answer. Then, that I knew, that the ranch and the horses and the work were real, but she was the thing that made them worth anything. He looked down at the cup. I don't think she doubted it. Nora was not a woman who doubted things without reason. But I would have wanted to say it out loud, once, clearly. So there was no question. Maren looked at him. His jaw was set. His hands were still on the cup. Nothing on his face that most people would have called distress, but she had spent enough time near him now to read what lived under his surface, and what she saw, there was a grief that had been carried a very long time in the particular way of people who do not put things down because they are not sure what they would be without the weight. She knew, Maren said. He looked at her. Not because I knew her, she said, but because of the gloves, the curtains, the ribbon. She held his gaze. A woman knows when she is held. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind that happens when something true has been said and both people are letting it settle into its proper place. After a moment, he exhaled. Not dramatically, just the breath of a man who has been holding something and has, for now, allowed himself to set it down. "Your turn," he said. She looked out at the stars. She had not planned to tell him. She had not planned to tell anyone. The habit of keeping her own story close was well established by now, built over years of discovering that other people's knowledge of her difficulties had a tendency to become a form of power over her. But there was something in the way he had just spoken, the stripped-down honesty of it, the willingness to be seen in an unglamorous truth that made concealment feel like a wrong response. She told him about the mill, about the 4 years she had kept the accounts at the Hartwell textile mill in Columbus, the competence she had built, and the trust she had earned and the life she had made on the modest but reliable foundation of being very good at what she did. About the new superintendent, Mr. Greer, who arrived in the spring of 1881 with smooth manners and small eyes and a particular way of standing too close. About the evening in the storage corridor when he had made what he clearly believed was a reasonable proposal, and her refusal, which he had not received as graciously as he might have. About the Monday morning when she arrived to find her desk cleared and a termination notice signed with the recommendation that she not seek employment in the city on the grounds of irregularities in the accounts she had kept. "There were no irregularities," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with the steady gray attention that she had learned was not judgment, only the desire to understand accurately. "My family believed him," she said. "My brother held a particular view about the sort of woman who found herself in that kind of difficulty with an employer. He did not say it directly, but he said it clearly enough." She looked back at the stars. "My mother had been gone 2 years by then. It was her bag I took when I left. I thought it was the right thing to take." "It was," he said. "I answered Percival Good's advertisement 3 months later. There were others. I chose him because his letter was the most specific about the work involved, the cattle operation, the accounts, the domestic requirements. Specific things are harder to fabricate entirely." A pause. "I was mostly right about that." "Mostly," he said. The photograph gave him away. No working rancher in this part of the country takes portraits in front of painted columns. She looked at her hands. "But I came anyway, because the alternative was staying, and staying had stopped being possible." He was quiet for a long moment. "You didn't beg," he said finally. "On the platform. You could have. Most people would have. Would it have helped?" His mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close enough to count. "No. That's why I didn't." They sat for a while in the comfortable dark. She had not told that story in the full sequence of it before. She had given pieces of it to various people over the past year, the version required by the situation, the amount of explanation that would produce the right practical outcome. She had never given the whole of it at once to one person. It felt lighter, having said it, not resolved. Wounds did not resolve from being spoken, but lighter, as if the thing that had been sealed in a room had been opened to air. "Nora would have liked you," Calder said. Maren looked at him. She had no patience for people who made themselves small to fit what others expected. He turned the cup in his hands once more. A gesture she had come to understand was not restlessness, but thinking. "She would have put you straight to work on the accounts the first week and called it obvious," Something tightened in Maren's chest. Not painfully, more like a string being tuned to the right tension. "I have been working on the accounts," she said. He went still. She had made the decision during supper, watching him across the long table in the way she did when she was measuring something. She had been carrying the knowledge of the ledger for 10 days, turning it over, adding to it, making sure of what she knew before she said it. She was sure enough now. She set down her coffee cup. She looked at him directly. "Someone has been drawing money from your accounts for the past 8 months, she said. "Not large amounts at any one time. Small enough to disappear into the ordinary expenses of running this operation. Large enough that the total is significant." She told him the number. He was very still. "I can show you exactly which entries," she said. "The pattern is consistent. Whoever is doing this understands your accounts well enough to know how to move inside them without attracting attention. That means someone with access and some knowledge of how the books are kept." The quality of his stillness had changed. She watched him absorb it, the way a person absorbs something that restructures what they thought they knew, the particular internal adjustment of a mind working through implications. "How long did it take you to find it?" he said. "The first night I saw the ledger, I noticed the page was out of order. It took me about an hour of actual looking to understand the pattern. Then, another week to be certain I was reading it correctly and not finding something that wasn't there." He looked at her. "Why did you wait?" "Because I needed to be sure," she said. "And because it was not my ledger. I was deciding whether knowing this was my business or not." "And what decided you?" She looked at the barn. At the dark space where Sable and Rosie and Duchess were sleeping, alive and mending. At the pale line of the fence that stretched out into the dark land that was this ranch, this thing he had built and kept faith with for 15 years, through grief and drought and loss. "The horses," she said simply. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, slowly, with the deliberate movement of a man who has been sitting with something heavy and is deciding how to carry it differently. He looked out at the dark land. "I'll need to see it," he said. "I know. Come to the kitchen house in the morning. I'll have everything laid out." He nodded, reached down and picked up her empty cup from the rail, held both cups in one hand and stood on the step above her. And for a moment, she was aware of him, the way she had been trying, carefully, not to be aware of him, the size of him against the star-thick sky, the steadiness of him, the way he stood in difficult things. "Miss Holt," he said. "Maren," she said, and was surprised to hear it come out of her own mouth. He looked at her. Then, Maren. First name, first time. It landed between them with a weight entirely disproportionate to its syllables. "Good night," he said. "Good night, Mr. Merritt." He went across the yard. She watched him until the main house door closed behind him. Then she sat for a while longer in the cooling dark, listening to the horses settle. The following morning, she laid the ledger out on the kitchen table with her notes alongside it, every entry flagged, the running total calculated 3 ways to be certain of it. Calder sat across from her and went through it with the focused attention of a man who did not want to be right and was being right anyway. When he finished, he closed the book and sat for a moment with his hands flat on the cover. He thanked her without looking up. She understood that the thanks was real and that the difficulty of it had nothing to do with her. That afternoon, Gideon Rawls stopped her in the yard. He was not a man who stopped people in yards. He moved with purpose and kept his conversations short and practical, and she had cataloged this about him in the first week and adjusted her interactions accordingly. So when he stepped into her path with his hat in his hands, she understood that something was being made difficult for him. "I want to say something," he said. He was looking at the middle distance rather than at her, which she recognized as a particular form of honesty in men who found directness uncomfortable. "You've been good for this place, for the men." A pause. "For him." She waited. "I don't say that easy," he said. "I've been on this ranch 11 years. I've seen it through dry years and bad years and the year after Mrs. Merritt passed, which was the worst kind of year there is. I know what this place looks like when it's going wrong." He looked at her now. "It doesn't look like that right now." Maren held his gaze. "Thank you, Gideon." He put his hat back on, nodded once, walked away. She stood in the yard for a moment after he had gone, feeling the weight of what he had given her, which was not just a compliment, but a testimony. The particular significance of the hardest man on the property choosing to say, out loud, in plain daylight, that she belonged here. It was 3 days later that Mrs. Cornelia Fitch called the community meeting. Maren heard about it from Fletcher, who heard it from the dry goods clerk, who had it from the Reverend's wife, a gathering at the church hall the Thursday evening to discuss matters of community concern. No further specification, none was required. She thought about not going. She sat with that option for the better part of an afternoon, turning it over, measuring the cost of avoiding it against the cost of attending it. Absence was a kind of answer, and not the kind she wanted to give. She had spent enough of her life being defined by what others said in rooms she was not present in. On Thursday evening, she put on her best dress, the dark blue wool she had been saving, and walked into town. The church hall was full. She stood at the back for a moment before anyone noticed her, counting faces. 40 or so. Women and men both. The assembled social architecture of Sunset Creek looking toward the front of the room where Mrs. Cornelia Fitch stood with the composed authority of someone who had called this meeting and fully intended to run it. Mrs. Fitch was mid-sentence when she saw Maren. A pause, brief but visible to everyone who had been watching her. Then she continued, and the room turned to follow her gaze, and Maren felt 40 pairs of eyes find her at the back of the hall. She walked to the front, not because she had planned to, or perhaps because she had planned to from the moment she decided to come. She walked with her spine straight and her hands at her sides, and she stood in front of Mrs. Cornelia Fitch, and she turned to face the room. "I understand this meeting concerns me," she said. Her voice carried without being raised, a skill learned early. "I'd rather you ask your questions directly." A silence of the quality that happens when a room recalculates its expectations. Then she told them. Not everything. The parts that were hers to tell. She told them about Ohio, without the details she had given Calder because those were his to hold and no one else's. She told them that she had come in good faith to an arrangement made by a man who had not honored it. She told them that she had accepted employment from Mr. Merritt as a cook and kept to the terms of that employment without variation. She told them that she had discovered irregularities in the ranch accounts which she had reported to the owner, and that the matter was being addressed. She did not tell them the amount. She did not name the source. She did not know the source with certainty yet, and she would not make an accusation she could not support. She said what she knew and stopped. The room was quiet. Near the back, a woman raised her hand. "Margaret Teller, wife of one of the Merritt ranch hands, who had been among the group that had walked alongside Maren after the church run-in with Mrs. Fitch the previous week. "I've eaten Miss Holt's cooking," Margaret said, with the straightforward delivery of a woman who considers this relevant evidence. "My husband has worked a better week every week since she arrived. That's what I know." A murmur, not unanimous, but present. Mrs. Cornelia Fitch looked at Maren with an expression that was working very hard at neutrality and not entirely succeeding. Whatever she had expected from this evening, it had not been this. A woman who did not defend herself indirectly through supporters or through tears, but stood at the front of the room and said plainly what was true. Maren looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking anyone to trust me on faith," she said. "I'm asking for the same thing I would ask for anywhere. Judge what you see, not what you've heard." She walked out. She walked the full mile back to the ranch in the dark, and the cooling air came off the grass on either side of the road, and the stars burned cold overhead, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, the particular clarity that comes after saying a true thing in a hard place. Not triumph, not relief exactly. More like the feeling of having stood in the right spot when the moment required it. She turned in at the ranch gate. The kitchen house was dark. The main house had a single light in the lower window. She was almost to her door when she saw it. Her carpet bag sitting on the porch step, set down with the same careful deliberateness with which Calder Merritt had placed it in the wagon the night he had brought her here. Not thrown, not left carelessly, placed. Precisely, as if by someone who understood the weight of what they were setting down. Maren stood and looked at it for a long moment. The light in the main house window did not move. She did not go to the door and knock. She did not call out. She stood in the yard in the dark and the cooling air and looked at her carpet bag on the porch step, and she felt the meaning of it move through her chest like cold water. Not violent, just present, just undeniable. Someone had decided she was leaving. She picked up the bag. She took it inside. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and held it in her lap and breathed. Then she set it on the floor and went to sleep, because she had decided she was not leaving. And in the morning, she would need to figure out which of those two decisions was going to win. She did not sleep well. Not because of fear, though fear was present in the room with her, quiet and patient in the corner, the way fear tends to wait when it knows it has time. She did not sleep well because she kept returning to the carpet bag on the porch step, turning the fact of it over in her mind, the way a person runs their tongue along a sore tooth, unable to leave it alone long enough to rest. Someone had placed it there. Not a message left in anger, not something done in haste or heat. The bag had been set down with intention, with the particular care that communicated, "I have thought about this, and I am telling you clearly." She had recognized that quality in the placement of it the moment she saw it, because she had spent enough years reading the language of what people did when they could not bring themselves to say a thing directly. By the time the first gray of dawn began at the eastern window, she had been awake for 2 hours. She rose, dressed, built the kitchen fire. She made biscuits because biscuits required her hands, and she needed her hands occupied while her mind worked. She measured the flour and cut in the lard and added the buttermilk in the slow, careful way, the way that produced height and tenderness. And she thought about what she knew. She knew the bag had not placed itself. She knew that Gideon Rawls had been on this ranch 11 years and would not have done it without instruction. She knew that Fletcher was too young and too fond of her biscuits to have the motive. She knew that the hands who had walked with her in the yard and eaten at her table for 3 weeks had given her no reason to think any of them wanted her gone, which left the main house. She put the biscuits in the oven. She thought about the community meeting, about standing at the front of the room and saying what was true, about the 40 faces turning toward her and the quality of the silence that had followed, about Mrs. Cornelia Fitch's expression working very hard at neutrality and not quite achieving it. And she thought about the one face that had not been there. Calder Merritt had not come to the meeting. She had known he was not there without looking for him, the way you know a particular sound is absent because the room sounds different without it. He had not come. And sometime between the meeting and her return to the ranch, the carpet bag had appeared on the porch step. The connection between these two facts arranged itself in her mind with the quiet certainty of something she had been refusing to look at directly. He had not come because he had not been able to decide to come, and not being able to decide was its own kind of answer. A man who had spent 15 years building a reputation in this country, a reputation that had survived drought and loss and the slow hard work of grief, had looked at the cost of standing publicly beside a woman whose presence was already generating the kind of talk that stuck to a name, and he had not been able to decide. She understood this. She wished she did not, but she did. She had seen it before. Not cruelty, not indifference. Something more complicated and, in its own way, more painful. A good man looking at the arithmetic of what standing up for something would cost him and finding, in that moment, that he could not do the calculation fast enough. The biscuits came out of the oven. She set them on the board to cool. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the main house. The light was on in the lower window. He was up then. Had been up, likely, for the same reasons she had. She watched the light for a long moment and felt something in her chest settle into a decision the way sediment settles in still water, slowly, without drama, until it is simply where it is. She went to her room and took the ledger from under the bed where she had kept it for the past week, along with the pages of notes she had made in her own careful hand. She had made a copy. She had made 2, in fact, written out in the small hours of the previous week when the ranch was quiet and her handwriting was at its most precise. One copy she had folded into an envelope with the sheriff's name on it. The other was in a second envelope addressed to Judge Alderman in Amarillo, whose name she had found in the Sunset Creek Courier as the presiding judge for the county. She had not sent them yet. She had been waiting until she was certain. She was certain now. She tucked both envelopes into the pocket of her apron. Breakfast she made and served without conversation beyond what was necessary. The men ate well, as they always did, and the kitchen was warm and full of the smell of good food, and she moved through it with the practiced efficiency of someone who has decided what comes next and is simply waiting for the moment to arrive. After the hands had gone out to the day's work, she cleared the table and washed the dishes, and then she sat down and wrote the note. She wrote 3 versions before she found the one she could live with. Not the version that explained everything, because she did not have the right to write that version in a way that would wound him unnecessarily. Not the version that was merely practical, because that would be a lie of omission. The version she kept was 4 sentences. Mr. Merritt, I found the carpet bag on the porch step last evening. I understand what was meant by it. I am leaving so that the thing you are trying to protect will not be damaged further by my presence. The kitchen is stocked for 2 weeks. The horses need their poultices changed morning and evening until the swelling in Duchess's leg is fully gone. With gratitude, M. Holt. She folded the note. She placed it on the kitchen table, weighted by the salt cellar, so it would not blow if the door opened. She looked at the blue shawl hanging on the peg by the door. He had given it to her the second week, brought it to the kitchen house one evening without comment, set it on the porch rail, and gone back to the main house without waiting to see if she took it. She had taken it. She had worn it every evening since on the porch, sitting with the coffee and the stars, and, more recently, with him. She left it on the peg. She picked up her carpet bag. She put on her coat. She went to the kitchen door and looked back once at the room she had brought into order, the clean counter and the organized larder and the sourdough crock fed and covered on the back shelf, alive and rising. And then she went out. The morning was cool and still. The sun was not yet fully over the horizon, just the suggestion of it, pale gold behind the eastern grass. The horses were moving in the paddock, Sable and Rosie and Duchess, the three of them together in the corner near the fence where the sun would hit first. Sable's cuts were healing clean. Rosie's ribs were filling in. Duchess moved without the pronounced hitch in her left foreleg that had been there the night Maren first came into the barn. She watched them for a moment, then she turned and walked toward the road. She heard Gideon Rawls's voice from the barn, the low direction of a man giving the morning's orders, and she kept walking. She heard the soft sound of the main house door, or thought she did, but she did not look back. Looking back had never once helped her, and she was not going to let it start now. The road to Sunset Creek was 4 miles. The morning was cool enough to walk it without difficulty. She had walked longer on harder days. She was perhaps a 1/4 mile down the road when she heard hoofbeats behind her. Not Calder. She knew his horse's pace, and this was different, shorter strided and hurrying, the sound of an animal being pushed a little harder than its usual preference. She stopped and turned. Gideon Rawls pulled up beside her on his roan, looking down at her with the expression of a man who has been given an instruction he found difficult and is executing it in spite of that. "He doesn't know I'm here," Gideon said. "I came myself." Maren looked up at him. "Came to say that whatever he's done or not done, it wasn't because of what you did." The foreman's voice had the careful quality of a man choosing each word. "He's been standing in one place for 4 years now, just standing. A man does that long enough, he forgets how to take a step." She looked at the road ahead, the flat line of it running toward town through the pale morning grass. "I know," she said. "Then you know he's worth waiting on." "Gideon." She looked at him directly. "I've been waiting for things to become possible my whole life. I waited in Ohio for my family to see what was in front of them. I waited at the depot for a man who was never coming. I am done waiting for things that may not happen." She kept her voice level, not unkind. "If he knows his own mind, he knows where I'll be." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, with the slow respect of a man who has heard something he recognizes as true. He turned his horse and rode back toward the ranch. Maren walked on. She stopped at the post office first, where the postmaster received her 2 envelopes with a glance at the addresses and no further inquiry. She asked if delivery could be expedited. He said the morning rider went out within the hour. She thanked him and paid the postage from the $12 in her purse. Then she went to the general store, where Emmett Baird, the owner, was unlocking the front door, and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had been in the room Thursday evening and had heard what she said and was still working out what he thought about it. "Miss Holt," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Baird. I need to ask if you have a room or a corner I might use for a few days. I can work for the accommodation. Your accounts, your stock, whatever is useful. She held his gaze. I am a very good bookkeeper. Emmett Baird looked at her for a moment. Then he held the door open wider. My accounts, he said, are a genuine catastrophe. She went in. The room he gave her was barely a room, more a partitioned corner behind the stock shelves with a cot and a window that looked onto the alley. But it was clean, and it was hers, and it had a door. She set her carpet bag down and sat on the cot and pressed her hands together in her lap and let herself feel, for exactly 1 minute, the full weight of what she had left behind. Then she stood up and went to find Emmett Baird's accounts. She had been working for an hour, the ledger open on the counter, her notes accumulating beside it, when the sound of horses in the street grew louder than the morning usual. She heard voices she did not recognize, then one she did. Percival Good, the particular smooth projection of a man accustomed to being heard in large rooms. She did not go to the window. She kept her pen moving across the page. She heard Percival's voice say her name twice, the second time with the particular quality of a man who is not accustomed to having to repeat himself. She heard other voices, Emmett Baird's from the front of the store. A third voice, lower, with the flat authority of a legal man accustomed to the weight of official documents. Silas Croft. She had heard the name from Fletcher, who had heard it from the dry goods clerk, who had it from the hotel. A lawyer from Amarillo arrived in Sunset Creek 3 days ago on what he described as land business. She had not yet learned exactly what land, though she had her suspicions. She kept working. 20 minutes later, the sounds outside had settled. She heard Percival Good's voice again, closer, and then Emmett Baird's voice saying something she could not make out, and then quiet. Emmett appeared in the doorway of her corner. Man outside asking for you, he said. Well dressed. Unpleasant. I know who it is, she said without looking up from the ledger. Tell him I'm not available. Emmett appeared to find this perfectly satisfactory. He went back to the front of the store. She heard the brief exchange at the door, and then Percival Good's voice, closer now, and losing some of its smoothness at the edges, the way voices do when something is not proceeding as planned. Then a longer silence. Then footsteps retreating. She worked until midday. At the ranch, she would later learn from Fletcher, who had ridden into town for the afternoon post and seen everything and could not have been prevented from reporting it if someone had tried, the following had occurred. Percival Good had arrived at Merritt Ranch at mid-morning on horseback, accompanied by Silas Croft and Croft's clerk, carrying a document he described as a prior claim to the hand of Maren Holt and a letter from a judge he knew in Dallas that he intended to use in some manner he had not fully explained to anyone's satisfaction. He had found Gideon Rawls, and Gideon Rawls had found 17 of the 20 Merritt Ranch Cowboys, who had apparently finished the morning's fence work ahead of schedule and were available. No violence had been committed, Fletcher reported, with some disappointment. But the quality of the attention directed at Percival Good and Silas Croft by the assembled personnel of Merritt Ranch had been, by all accounts, sufficient to communicate everything that needed communicating without the use of language. Silas Croft, who was a practical man when it came to the protection of his own person, had suggested to Percival that they retire to town and reconsider their approach. Percival had concurred. What Fletcher did not report, because he had not seen it, was what happened at the ranch after the visitors had gone. Calder Merritt had read the note. He had found it when he came into the kitchen for coffee, and the kitchen was empty and clean, and the stove was banked, and the blue shawl was on the peg, and the note was on the table, weighted with the salt cellar. He had stood at the table and read it once, and then he had read it again, and then he had set it down and stood for a long time with his hands flat on the table and looked at nothing. Then he had gone to the paddock. The 3 horses were in the corner by the fence. He stood at the rail and watched them for a while. Sable, who had been tangled in wire and cut to the bone, and had still, somehow, been standing when help arrived. Rosie, who had stopped eating and started again. Duchess, whose leg was almost right. He went around the barn to the back, where the land flattened out and the grass grew longer in the shade of the old post oak, where the stone was set into the ground with the name cut into it by his own hand in the September of 1878. Nora Merritt, beloved. He crouched down. He stayed there for a long time. The morning moved around him, the sounds of the ranch continuing, the ordinary life of the place going on without interruption, because that was the nature of a working ranch. It did not pause for a man's private accounting. He had not spoken to Nora in 4 years. Not since the first year, when he had still been in the part of grief where a person talks to the absent one as if the distance might be bridged by sufficient sincerity. He had stopped because it had not helped him, which was not the same as saying it was wrong, only that he had not known then what to say that would be true. He knew now. "I've been standing still," he said. His voice was low, not for secrecy, but because the words were not large enough to require volume. "You'd have told me that. You'd have used more words and a particular tone, and you'd have been right, which would have made it worse and better at the same time." He looked at her name in the stone. "I've been afraid, not of the wrong things, of the right things, which is harder to defend." A pause. The wind moved through the oak leaves overhead. A dry sound. September rattling toward October. "She walked to town this morning. 4 miles. Carrying that bag. And I let her." His hands were on his knees. He looked at them, at the calluses and the old scars and the work written into the skin of them. "She sent something to the sheriff," he said. "She figured out the accounts, and she sent the evidence before she left. Not after. Before." He was quiet for a moment. "She protected the ranch when I couldn't protect her." The wind moved again. He thought about the ribbon on the reins. He had tied it there in the first year. He had stopped knowing why he kept it there somewhere around the 3rd year, which was perhaps the truest reason to keep anything. Not because it made sense, but because removing it would have been a statement he was not ready to make. "She left the shawl," he said. "She could have taken it. She left it." The oak leaves moved. The morning was fully established now, the sun high enough to warm the stone where his wife's name was cut. He put his hand on the stone, flat, the way he had placed Maren's carpet bag in the wagon bed, with intention, not ceremony, just contact. "You'd tell me to go," he said. "You'd have told me an hour ago." He stood. He stood for a moment looking down at the stone, at the name in it, and he felt the grief in him shift, not leave. Grief of that kind does not leave. It only changes its weight and its distribution, the way a load resettles when you've been carrying it long enough. What he felt was not the grief leaving, but himself, finally, moving while still carrying it. He went to the barn. He saddled his horse with quick, deliberate movements, the efficiency of a man who has made a decision and is not reconsidering it. He was cinching the girth when Gideon appeared in the barn doorway. "Merritt," Gideon said. "I know," Calder said. "She said if you knew your own mind, you'd know where she was." He checked the cinch. "Does she still have that bag?" "Far as I know." He led the horse out of the barn. He swung up into the saddle and looked down at Gideon, who was watching him with the expression of a man who has worked for someone long enough to recognize the moments that matter and knows better than to say too much in them. "Percival Good comes back," Calder said. "I'd be grateful if you'd let the sheriff handle it." Gideon looked at him steadily. "The sheriff's already been contacted," he said. "Apparently." Calder looked at him for a moment. Then something in his expression changed, some last remaining resistance giving way to something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. He turned the horse toward town. The blue ribbon on the left rein caught the morning light as he rode, pale and faded, moving with the motion of the horse. He had not taken it down. He did not take it down now. He rode with it the way he had ridden with it for 4 years, because there were things you carried and things you set down, and the wisdom was in knowing which was which. He rode through the gate and down the road toward Sunset Creek, and the land lay open around him in the October near morning, wide and clear and full of consequence. And he did not look back at the ranch because the ranch would be there when he returned. He intended to return with more than he had left with. The carpet bag was still in her corner room when he arrived. He knew this because Emmett Baird, who had apparently decided something about Maren Holt in the course of the morning and was acting on it, met him at the door of the general store and told him she was in the back, and that he, Emmett, was going to be very busy at the front of the store for the next little while, and would not be disturbed by anything short of the building catching fire. Calder went in. She was at the small table, her back to the doorway, her pen moving across a ledger page. She heard his footsteps, and her pen slowed, but she did not turn around. He came to the table. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and he waited until she had finished the line she was writing and set down the pen before he spoke. "I'm not here," he said, "because I feel guilty." She looked at him. Her expression was careful, the controlled composure of someone who has made a decision and is not going to be easily moved off it. But underneath it, in the slight tension at the corners of her eyes, he could see the cost of keeping it. "I know what I did," he said. "I didn't come. I knew what the meeting was, and I looked at what it would cost, and I didn't come. That was wrong. I'm not here to ask you to forgive it. I'm here because not forgiving it myself and sitting in the ranch house being sorry is the smallest and most useless thing I can do with what happened, and I don't intend to do it." She was very still. "You walked 4 miles, he said, "this morning, carrying that bag, and I let you walk them." He looked at her directly. "I'm not asking you to forget that. I'm asking you to believe that it will not happen again. Not because I'm a different man than I was yesterday. Because yesterday, I finally understood something I should have understood sooner. And understanding it changes what I do next." She looked at him for a long moment, with the clear assessing directness he had recognized from the first evening on the platform, the look of a woman who did not take things at face value and had learned, at some cost, why that was necessary. "What did you understand?" she said. He looked at his hands, at the work written into them. Then he looked at her. "That standing still is not the same as being safe," he said. "I've been treating them like they were the same thing for 4 years. They're not. He held her gaze. And that a woman who sends the evidence to the sheriff before she leaves to protect something that was hurting her is not a woman I can afford to let walk away. The corner room was quiet. Outside, the sounds of Sunset Creek's midday moved past the alley window, ordinary and indifferent. Inside, the weight of the morning settled between them, heavy and real and fully earned by both of them. "You let someone put my bag on the porch step," she said. "Yes." "You didn't come to the meeting." "No." She looked at him. The careful composure was still there. Under it, he could see her measuring the distance between what he had done and what he was saying now, deciding whether it was crossable. Maren. He said her name the way he had said it on the porch that first night, with the full weight of meaning it. Every morning on this ranch is better because you are in it, not because of the food, though the food is extraordinary, because of what you see when you look at things, because of the way you stand in hard places, because of what you did for those horses. He paused. Because of what you did for me, without knowing that was what you were doing. Her jaw was level. Her hands were flat on the table, but her eyes had changed. "I have nothing to offer you that looks simple or uncomplicated," he said. "There's a ranch with accounts that have been bled for 8 months. There's Nora's name on a stone behind the barn. There's 15 years of habits that will need working on." He did not look away. "But there is also the fact that I am sitting in this chair instead of the ranch house, which is where I would be if I intended to go on doing what I've been doing." The silence lasted long enough to have a shape. "You have very poor timing," Maren said. Something in his chest released. "I know. And you owe me 4 miles. I know that too." She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she looked down at the ledger in front of her, at the column of numbers she had been working on, and she placed her pen across the page to mark her place. "There is something else you should know," she said, "before anything else is decided." She looked up. "I sent copies of the ledger evidence to the sheriff and to Judge Alderman in Amarillo this morning, before I left the ranch. Whatever happens between us, that evidence is already in motion. Silas Croft will be dealt with by the law and not by you." He looked at her. "You protected the ranch," he said, "before you left." "I protected what was worth protecting." She held his gaze. "I wasn't sure at the time if that included you." The morning light in the alley window moved. Outside, Sunset Creek went on about its ordinary business. Inside the partitioned corner of Emmett Baird's general store, 2 people sat across a table from each other in the particular silence that exists just before a decision that cannot be unmade. "Are you sure now?" Calder said. Maren Holt looked at him for a long time. "Ask me something harder," she said. The question hung between them like smoke after a fire, not dissipating, just present, in the particular way that things which have been said aloud take on a different weight than the same things thought in private. Calder Merritt sat across the small table in the back corner of Emmett Baird's general store and looked at the woman who had just told him to ask her something harder, and he understood that she was not being difficult. She was being accurate, which was, he had come to understand, one of the most consistent things about her. He set the blue shawl on the table between them. She looked at it, then at him. "You left it," he said. "I know I left it." You left it because you wanted me to know you weren't taking something with you that carried hope in it. He kept his eyes on her face. I'm returning it because I want you to know the hope is still there, on my end, whether you take it back or not. Maren looked at the shawl for a long moment. The fabric was soft from use, the blue of it, the particular depth that comes from a good dye worn in by weather and wear. She had put it on every evening for 3 weeks. She knew exactly how it felt across her shoulders. She picked it up, folded it once, set it beside her on the cot, not around her shoulders, not returned to him. Beside her, in the space between decided and not yet decided. Ask me, she said. He looked at his hands, at the table, at the window where the alley light came in gray and indirect. Then he looked at her with the full weight of his gray eyes and the complete absence of any performance, which she had learned was the truest version of him. Maren Holt, he said, will you marry me? Not because you need a place to be, not because I need someone to run my kitchen, because I want to spend the rest of my time on this earth with a woman who sends evidence to the sheriff before she leaves a place, to protect something that was causing her harm, because that is the kind of person I want to stand next to. A pause. Because when I sat by Nora's stone this morning, I finally understood the difference between honoring what was and refusing what could be. And what could be is sitting across this table from me. The room was quiet. Outside, Sunset Creek moved through its ordinary afternoon. A wagon on the main street. Someone calling a name across the road. The sound of Emmett Baird moving deliberately at the front of the store, audibly occupied with nothing in particular. You sat by her stone, Maren said. Yes. This morning. Before I rode in. She was quiet for a moment, turning this over with the careful attention she gave to things that deserved it. What did you say to her? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, the way he considered things that were real. That I'd been standing still. That she would have told me so and been right. That the woman who walked 4 miles this morning with that bag deserved better than what I'd given her. He paused. That I intended to go and find out if it wasn't too late. Maren looked at the shawl beside her. She thought about the depot platform on the 4th of September, the amber light and the 12 cents, and the letter with its careful lying penmanship. She thought about the carpet bag set gently in the wagon bed by hands that had understood, even then, that something carried deserved care. She thought about the tack room shelf and the folded gloves and the photograph placed face down with a grief too private for explanation. She thought about 3 injured horses in a barn at midnight and the slow hours of working side by side in lantern light. She thought about what it cost a person to ride 4 miles into town and sit in a chair and say plainly, I was wrong, and here is what I intend to do about it. She had spent a great deal of her life waiting for people to see what was in front of them. Her family, her employer, the assembled population of Sunset Creek on a Thursday evening. She had stopped expecting it. She had stopped somewhere along the way, believing it was a thing that happened to her. Yes, she said. No theater in it. No tears. The word came out the way true things come out when a person has stopped being afraid of them. Quietly. With the full weight of intention behind it. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically. More like a room when someone opens a window that has been closed for a long time. a quality of air returning to a space that had forgotten it. "Yes," she said again, because the first time had been quiet enough that she wanted to be sure it had landed where it was meant to go. "Don't make me regret it." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'll do my best." "Your best," she said, "will need to be better than last Tuesday." "Last Tuesday was a low point," he agreed. "I don't intend to revisit it." She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them on the small table, the ledger sat with her pen across the page marking where she had stopped working. The ordinary evidence of a practical woman in the middle of a practical task, interrupted by something that had turned out to matter more. She reached across the table and picked up the pen. She finished the line she had been writing, checked the total at the bottom of the column, and closed the ledger. "We should go tell Emmett," she said. "He's been very deliberately not listening for the past 20 minutes, and he deserves to know his efforts were worthwhile." Calder stood and offered his hand across the table, not to pull her to her feet, because she did not need that, but in the manner of a man walking beside someone who is choosing to walk beside him. She took it. They went out to the front of the store together. Emmett Baird looked up from the counter where he was very thoroughly reorganizing something that had not needed reorganizing, and his face arranged itself into an expression of moderate surprise that convinced no one. "All settled?" he said. "All settled," Maren said, "and your accounts are a genuine catastrophe. I've made a start, but you'll want someone in here regularly." "I know a good bookkeeper," Emmett said, looking at her with the deliberate innocence of a man stating something obvious. Calder picked up Maren's carpet bag from beside the counter, where she had set it when she arrived that morning. He carried it to the door and held it open. She went through. They had not yet reached the edge of town when Calder spotted 2 horses tied at the post outside the hotel, still saddled, still dusty from the road. He recognized the bay at once. He did not say anything. He simply looked toward the ranch road and kept moving. But Maren had seen it too. They were almost to the gate of Merritt Ranch when a rider came down the road toward them at a canter. Percival Good, hat straight, coat buttoned, wearing the composed expression of a man who has decided to make one final attempt and has rehearsed what he intends to say. He pulled up short when he saw them riding together. His eyes moved from Calder to Maren and back, and in that movement something in his careful expression shifted, recalculating. He looked at Maren the way a man looks at something he believed was his, and is discovering was never his at all. "Miss Holt," he said. The smoothness was still there, but thinner now. The way polish wears away at the edges first. "Mrs. Merritt," Maren said. She said it the way she said most things, plainly, without performance, with the full weight of its meaning, and not 1 ounce more. The road was quiet. The October grass moved in a light wind. Calder sat his horse without expression, which was its own kind of expression, and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying that had not already been said. Percival Good looked at them both for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward town. They watched him go. At the bend in the road, where the track curved past the stand of post oak and disappeared from view, he did not look back. Sheriff Calhoun was waiting at the ranch gate with his deputy, a folded document in hand and the brisk manner of a man with business to attend to. He tipped his hat to Maren. He looked at Calder. "Got word from Judge Alderman this morning," he said. "Croft's at the hotel. We'll be collecting him directly." "I expect he'll be surprised," Calder said. "They always are," the sheriff said, and turned his horse toward town. Gideon Rawls was standing at the barn entrance when they rode through the gate. He looked at Maren. He looked at Calder. He looked at the carpet bag Calder was carrying. He put his hat back on and went back to work. That was all the conversation that was needed. At the paddock fence, Calder stopped his horse and dismounted. He stood for a moment with the reins in his hand, looking at the faded blue ribbon knotted around the left side of the leather, the one that had been there since the first year, the one he had stopped knowing the reason for keeping sometime around the third year. He untied it slowly, not with grief, not with ceremony, with the particular care of someone who understands that the gesture itself is the meaning. He held it for a moment in his palm. Then he looked at Maren, still mounted, watching him with the quiet attention she gave to things that were real. He walked to her horse and offered it up. She looked at it, the small faded ribbon, soft as paper now, the color of old cornflowers. She took it from his palm and held it between her fingers. "Nora's," he said. She nodded once. She understood what he was saying, which was not that the past was over, but that it was no longer something he needed to carry alone. She put it in her coat pocket, near her heart. She rode through the gate ahead of him. The wedding was on the 24th of October. Maren had not expected it to be much. She had not in truth expected anything in particular, because she had spent enough of her life organizing her expectations downward to avoid the particular species of pain that follows unmet ones. She had thought, a brief ceremony, the judge, 2 witnesses, the practical transaction of making a legal fact of something already decided. What she got was the kitchen full of ranch wives from 4 properties and the smell of baked goods she had not made herself and Fletcher in a shirt that had clearly been ironed for the first time in his life, standing very straight by the door and losing the battle with his own grin. Gideon Rawls in a clean hat, standing where the best man stands, with the expression of a man who considered this outcome correct and had held that opinion for some time. Mrs. Cornelia Fitch came. She arrived late, after the ceremony had begun, and stood at the back of the room with her hands folded and her expression arranged into something that was not quite warmth, but was, unmistakably, a decision to be present. She had brought a cake, a good one, layered, with the kind of frosting that takes time and intention. She set it on the table without announcement and stood at the back of the room and watched. Maren saw her there. She did not look away. Mrs. Fitch held her gaze for a moment, then gave a small and very precise nod. Maren nodded back. Some reconciliations do not require more than that. The ceremony was conducted by Reverend Hollis, a compact man with kind eyes who performed the words with the dignity they deserved and the efficiency appropriate to a room full of cowboys who had been waiting patiently since 2 o'clock and were thinking about supper. When it was done and the thing was a fact, Calder reached into his coat pocket. He took out the blue shawl. He held it for a moment between his hands, looking at it with the particular expression of a man handling something that has been many things over its history and is now becoming something else. He took Maren's right hand. He folded the shawl once more and tied it loosely around her wrist, not tight enough to bind, just present enough to be felt. A bracelet of faded blue, the color of old cornflowers. The color of a ribbon that had been carried in her coat pocket since the day she rode through the gate ahead of him. "Nora's," he said quietly, "just to her. The room's noise covered it for everyone else. Now yours, not instead of, in addition to." She looked down at her wrist, at the soft, faded blue against her skin. She had not cried at the community meeting. She had not cried the morning she walked 4 miles down the road with her carpet bag and her $12 and her intact dignity. She had not cried in Emmett Baird's back room, not when Calder came in, and not when she said yes. She did not cry now either. But she held the shawl at her wrist with the fingers of her other hand, and she let herself feel the full weight of what it meant, which was considerable. And she looked at Calder Merritt with the clear, direct gaze of a woman who has decided to stop being afraid of the things worth having. He looked back at her the same way. That evening, after the food was eaten and the guests had gone and the kitchen had been restored to something approaching order, Maren went out to the porch with her coffee. The night was fully cool now, the first real taste of what October intended. The stars were thick and close in the way they got when the air went clear and cold. She heard the door behind her. Calder came out with his own cup and sat on the top step, long legs stretched out, back against the post. The same configuration as that first evening, 3 weeks ago, when he had come across the yard without asking and sat and looked at the same stars she had been looking at, and they had begun, without quite naming it, the thing that had arrived where it was today. She looked at the barn. The paddock light was on, the soft glow of the lantern they kept burning low through the night, so the horses could find their water in the dark. 3 shapes moved in the paddock, slow and comfortable. Sable, his coat glossy now, the cuts on his flank healed to thin pale lines that would fade entirely by spring. Rosie, her ribs no longer showing, her movement easy and unhurried. Duchess, walking without the hitch, turning her head toward the light with the particular curiosity of an animal that has remembered the world is sometimes interesting. "She's walking clean," Maren said. "Has been for a week." He turned the cup in his hands. "I didn't want to say it until I was sure. In case it wasn't." Yes. She understood this. The caution of a person who has learned to wait until a good thing is established before trusting it out loud. She had the same habit. The night settled around them. The cooling air carried the smell of dry grass and the distant suggestion of rain that might or might not arrive, the way the Texas weather made its promises. "There's a letter inside," Calder said. "It came this morning. I didn't want to give it to you before the ceremony." She looked at him. "Ohio postmark," he said. "The handwriting on the outside is a man's." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the particular weight of that. Ohio, a man's handwriting. There was only one person in Ohio who would write to her with news serious enough to have held this long, through 2 years of silence, through everything. Her brother. She had not thought about him during these weeks, or rather she had thought about him the way you think about a wound that is scarred over, present in the awareness, but no longer demanding constant attention. He had chosen wrong, clearly and consequentially, and she had built a life on the far side of that choice. She had not expected to hear from him. She would read the letter tomorrow, in the morning, at the kitchen table, with coffee and the level head that morning gave her. Whatever it said, it would say the same thing tomorrow that it said tonight, and tonight she was sitting on a porch in Texas with her name on a deed and a faded blue shawl tied at her wrist, and 3 horses walking clean in the paddock. Tomorrow was soon enough for Ohio. "Tomorrow," she said. He nodded, as if this were entirely reasonable, which it was. They sat in the comfortable dark, the 2 of them and the stars, and the sound of the horses moving in the paddock. The lamp in the main house window cast its small, steady warmth through the glass. The kitchen house was dark because she did not live there anymore. She lived in the main house now, In the room at the front with the glass windows and the curtains that were still white, because they had been good curtains and there was no reason to change them. She had not taken them down. She had let them stay where they were, because they had been hung by someone who had known this house as home, and a house could hold more than one person's love for it without being diminished. Maren reached down and touched the shawl at her wrist. The old blue fabric, soft as paper now, carrying the weight of everything it had been. A ribbon on a rein. A thing kept when most things had been let go. A gesture toward honoring what was, while still moving toward what could be. She turned and looked at Calder on the step below her. He was looking at the paddock, at the 3 horses in the low lamplight, and his face held the expression she had learned was his version of contentment, quiet and unsentimental and entirely real, the look of a man who is exactly where he intended to be. "Calder," she said. He turned. She looked at him with the clear, direct gaze of Maren Holt Merritt, who had arrived in this town 6 weeks ago with 12 cents and a carpet bag and a spine that had not bent under any of the things that had tried to bend it, and she said the only thing there was left to say. "Thank you for coming to get me." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned back to the stars, and the horses, and the dark, wide land that was theirs now, both of theirs, with both their names on the deed. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for leaving the shawl." The night settled around them. The horses moved in the paddock. The stars burned overhead. The lamp in the window held its small and steady light against the Texas dark. And on the porch of Merritt Ranch, in the last days of October, 1882, 2 people who had both learned the particular cost of standing still sat together in the cooling air and let themselves, finally, stop counting the cost.